Okay, so now we're going to take a look at functions with return types. So this is the first time we've seen functions with return types. We've only seen functions with parameters and without them, but again, no return types. So these are going to be functions that return some kind of a value, some kind of a constant. So this could be a string or an int or a boolean, whatever we want it to be. Okay, and we're going to be able to use this constant that we returned. So I'm going to show some things that we can do with this return constant, such as storing them in variables and printing them out. Alright, so now let's take a look at functions that have return types. So we've seen functions that take in no parameters and some that take in some parameters. Now we're going to do kind of a combination. So this function, this first one that I'm going to show you, is going to take in a couple of parameters and it's going to have a return type as well. Okay, so what I want this function to do, and I'm just going to put a little comment here, is I want it to combine two strings and return them. And return a new string. Okay, so I'm just going to call this function combine strings. Okay, and I think that's an appropriate name because that's exactly what it's doing. So it's going to take in two parameters. One is going to be string 1 and it's going to be of type string, and the other is going to be string 2 and also of type string. Okay, so it's just going to take these two in and it's going to combine them and then it's going to return a string. Okay, so the way we declare a return type is by doing this. So we have this arrow here, and the way I created that is I just did a dash and then a greater than sign. Okay, so this just indicates that we have a return type and it's going to have to return a string, which means at some point we have to have a return and then something, some kind of a string. Okay, so how do we combine strings exactly? Well, if you remember back to our variables tutorial where we talked about strings, we can do a pretty cool thing where we can just take string 1 and add it to string 2. Okay, so this just sticks the second string right onto the end of the first string. So what we can do is we can simply just say return string 1 plus string 2. Okay, and this is one of the great things about Swift, is that in some languages we'd have to create this variable. We'd have to say let string 3 equals string 1 plus string 2, and then we'd have to return that. And that's perfectly valid. We can do that. We can say let string 3 equals string 1 plus string 2. That's fine. And then we can just say return string 3. But I think it's faster and quite honestly easier just to put this right in the return call. Okay, so this is just going to take in a string that we pass it. It's going to take in a second string. It's going to stick the second string right onto the end of it and return it. Okay, so if we call this function combine strings and we'll give it, I'm just going to press enter there and it gives us this kind of autofill thing here. So I'm just going to say mammoth, if I can get that capital, there we go. And I'm going to put a space so that the two strings aren't right together. And interactive. And let's see what happens. So there we go. Just put that there. We're going to wait for it to run. And we see we get, just going to increase the size here. We get Mammoth Interactive printed there. Well, it's not printed, but we get Mammoth Interactive shown here. In order to print it to the console, we'd have to call the print statement. Okay, so that's something we can do. There's three things that we can really do with this. The first thing is to do nothing, but I mean, what's the point of having a return type if we're not going to do something with that returned variable, or constant in this case? The second thing we can do is we can store it right in a variable, so we can say something like, or even a constant, whichever we want. We can say variable, let's just call this mammoth, equals the result of combined strings on string 1 and string 2. And then if we were to print out mammoth, or rather just say mammoth and see what value it holds, then it should hold whatever the value of the combined strings function is. And there we see we get Mammoth Interactive there. Okay, so this is one other thing we can do is we can store the results in a variable or a constant. Either one, it's fine. And so then we can use that variable or constant over and over again, and it will contain this value of this string plus this string. Okay. However, if we were to assign another variable, let's just call this let hello equal combined strings on, let's say string 1 is going to be, just have it say hell, and then this one can be low. And let's see what happens there. Just going to wait for it to run. There we go. See, it contains a value hello, and that's fine to do as well. So let's see, does it contain hello? And yes, it does. Okay, so we can call this function as many times and assign it to different variables each time if we want. So it's always going to combine these two strings, and that's pretty cool. And yeah, so we can store it in a variable or a constant if we want. Or there's one other thing we can do, is if we want to print out the results right away, we can call the print function on the function itself. So if we call it on combined strings and just pass in some strings, so let's just say hi and there, then basically it's just going to perform the function call. So it's going to carry out whatever combined strings tells us to do on these two strings. So it's going to take in hi and there, it's going to combine them together and return the string hi there, and then it's going to print the results of that function call out. Okay, so the order in which this works is it first calls a function on these two, it attaches them together, returns that attached string, and then calls the print function on that string. Okay, so here's three different things you can do with the return type. You can either do nothing, you can store it in a variable, or you can just call something like a print function or even other function calls on the results of that function. But we'll see a little bit more about that later. Okay, so let's just go ahead and recap what we've learned so far. So this was looking at functions that have return types. The way we do that is through this arrow. This is just simply a dash and then a greater than sign. So in this case, we passed in a couple of parameters into this function combined strings, and it's just going to take the second string, add it onto the end of the first one, and return the string that's a result of the two combined. So we saw that we can either store it in a constant, or let's just make this a variable. Okay, and we can call this function as many times with as many different, well, not quite as many different parameters. We can call it as many times as we want with different parameters that we saw. So we have the strings Mammoth and Interactive. Here we have the strings hell and low. And then lastly, we saw that we can actually insert the function into another function call. So the print function is a function of itself, where it just takes in whatever string or whatever input we want and it prints it out. So in this case, we're just taking in the function call combined strings, we're just going to return a string and we're just printing that out. Okay, so here's a few things you can do with functions that have return types. Okay, next time we'll be looking at stuff that's a little more complicated, so this will be functions with multiple return types. Alright, so in this part we looked at functions with return types. So the first function we looked at really was the combined strings function, and it just took in two strings as parameters, combined them, so added one right onto the end of the other, and returned the results. So that was going to be a string that had the two strings combined. So we saw that we can either store the results in a variable or a constant, or we can use them in a function call. So in the print function we actually did a direct call to the combined strings function, and basically it takes in it performs the call to the function, combines the strings, returns the string, and then prints it out there. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at functions with multiple return types.